My mother never had to tell me out loud that I was a disappointment. She taught me in quieter ways. In the way her smile tightened when I brought home another first-place ribbon. In the way her compliments always came with a caveat. You're very smart, Isabel, but you're also very sensitive. You're doing well, but don't get ahead of yourself. She taught me that pride was reserved for certain kinds of success, the loud kind. The clean, visible, quantifiable kind that you could write on holiday cards or drop casually into conversation over brunch. My little brother Caleb was a natural at that. He was charming in a way I never learned to be. Funny, photogenic, charismatic, and deeply ambitious in the ways our parents could understand. When I got into Columbia on scholarship, my mom told me, "That's nice, but maybe don't talk about the scholarship part too much. It sounds needy." When Caleb got into a mediocre business program at a private school, she threw him a dinner party. I learned to fold myself small early on, to shrink in photos so Caleb could shine, to speak softly so I wouldn't sound too proud, to succeed silently. At 16, I stopped inviting her to award ceremonies. At 18, I stopped expecting her to notice I was winning anything at all. Still, some part of me kept trying. Harvard Law, graduating with honors, clerking for a federal judge, working at one of the top firms in the state by the time I was 28. But when I told my mom about the promotion, she blinked and said, "Does that mean you're finally making what Caleb does?" She didn't ask if I was happy. She never did. That's what she taught me. Happiness is private. Appearances are public, and public always comes first. She liked to introduce me to her friends like I was some sort of family obligation. "This is Isabel, my daughter. She's very bright, but she works in nonprofit now. She left corporate law, burnout, probably." They'd nod, smile tightly, and ask me how volunteering was going. I never corrected them, because correcting them would have felt like admitting I needed to be seen. And if there's one thing my mother hated more than failure, it was neediness. She raised me to be self-contained, silent, competent to the point of invisibility. But even the most invisible child grows up eventually. And sometimes, just sometimes, that child learns to make a life so luminous that even a family's selective blindness can't dim it forever. I didn't know it yet at the time. But that reckoning, that moment where my mother's script finally cracked, was coming. And it would happen in the very room where she thought I'd remain the family's quiet embarrassment forever. The first time I thought about leaving the firm, I was sitting in a boardroom overlooking the city skyline, listening to a senior partner joke about how, even if the pipeline leaked, we'd just plug it with enough money. It wasn't meant to be cruel. It was just business. Profits, strategies, creative legal framing. I sat there in my tailored suit, notepad in hand, wondering how I had ended up on the wrong side of the people I once wanted to protect. Back in law school, I had imagined becoming the kind of lawyer that could stand between harm and the vulnerable. But somehow, in my climb to the top, I had become the mouthpiece for corporations who measured damage in PR points and settlement costs. That night, I called my mother. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd understand. "I'm thinking of leaving Prescott and Wallace," I told her. There was a long pause. "You finally made junior partner," she said. "Why would you throw that away?" "Because I'm not proud of the work," I replied. "Because I think I'm done defending people I'd never want to sit beside on a train." She sighed, one of those disappointed mother sighs that stretch across continents. "You've always had a flair for the dramatic, Isabel." I didn't argue, I just hung up. And 3 months later, I left. I drained half my savings, pulled every contact I had from my pro bono cases, and founded the Hartman Initiative, a legal strategy consultancy for grassroots nonprofits, education equity projects, and community reform coalitions. We weren't glamorous. Our office was a converted warehouse with bad heating. Our coffee was instant. Our hours were insane. But for the first time in years, I didn't dread Mondays. And slowly, very slowly, we began to change things. We helped a housing coalition win a multi-million-dollar class action against slumlords in Pittsburgh. We coached a startup in Detroit through the grant process and watched them become one of the largest STEM education incubators in the Midwest. We fought for women's education reform in the Deep South, rewrote policy briefs, trained leaders, rewired hope. I was tired, underpaid, but alive. Of course, my mother didn't see it that way. At Thanksgiving that year, she leaned across the table and said, "So how long is this detour going to last?" I smiled politely. "It's not a detour, Mom, it's the destination." She blinked. "You gave up a six-figure salary to write grant letters for activists. That's not noble, Isabel. That's self-sabotage." My father cleared his throat as he always did when things got uncomfortable. Caleb scrolled on his phone. No one said a word, and that was the moment I realized. To them, my value had always been tied to optics, to the kind of success you can photograph and post. I didn't need their applause, but I would have settled for their curiosity, their questions, their willingness to ask why I made this choice instead of assuming I had fallen from grace. Instead, I became a punchline, a cautionary tale. To my mother's friends, I was the daughter who burned out. To my relatives, I was the one who turned her back on prestige. To my brother, I was a ghost. But what none of them knew was that while they gossiped behind linen napkins, I was rebuilding the world they complained about from their dinner tables. One student, one neighborhood, one legal toolkit at a time. And somewhere out there, beyond their social circles and private wine tastings, someone knew my name for what it really meant. But I didn't know it yet. Not until the night Caleb got engaged. Not until the room turned cold. Not until the girl in the white dress stood up and called me by the name I had almost forgotten belonged to someone powerful. The restaurant was lit with soft chandeliers and the kind of gold-trimmed flatware that signaled someone was trying very hard to impress someone else. It was my brother Caleb's engagement dinner. My mother chose the venue naturally. French cuisine, linen napkins, 4 different forks. Not because Caleb liked any of that, he's more of a burgers and bourbon kind of guy, but because the Taylor family, Amara's side, ought to know we have class. I was seated 2 chairs down from my mother, at the end of the table, which seemed poetic in a cruel sort of way. Peripheral, but present. There, but not counted. I wore a navy blue sheath dress, clean lines, no drama. I had practiced my polite smile. I had come prepared to sit, sip my wine, and shrink as usual. Then came the toast. My mother stood up, gracefully clinking her glass with the tip of her spoon. "I'd like to say a few words," she said, eyes sweeping the room. "About Caleb, and about this family." I stiffened. It's always about the family when something cruel is coming. She turned toward Amara's parents. "You've raised a remarkable young woman, and we are thrilled to welcome her into our lives." Applause, smiles, Caleb beamed. Then she pivoted, too smoothly, toward the other end of the table. "And of course," she said, "we are a family of ambition and responsibility. Caleb has followed a path of excellence we've always valued. Hard work, discipline, success. That's what we try to instill in our children." I swallowed hard. She wasn't done. "Of course, not everyone takes the path we hoped for," she said, her tone light but edged. "Isabel, for example, has chosen a less conventional journey." Everyone turned to me. I didn't move. "She was always the academic," my mother continued, her voice syrupy. "Top schools, top firms, but sometimes bright minds take detours. Now she's working with, nonprofits. Grants, I think." A chuckle rippled through the table. Not unkind, not vicious, but I stared at my plate, the lamb cooling beneath a drizzle of sauce I couldn't name. "She used to be at Prescott and Wallace," my mother added, smiling wistfully. "That was a real achievement, but she left. No one really knows why." My hands gripped the napkin on my lap so tightly I thought the fabric might tear. "I suppose we all have to find our own version of fulfillment," she concluded, "even if it's not the kind that makes it onto the Wall Street Journal." The room went quiet. Polite, frozen. Then someone raised a glass. A few scattered toasts followed. The dinner moved on. But I didn't. I stayed in that moment, burning. Not because I hadn't heard it before, but because I had. Too many times. That tone, that perfectly performed condescension disguised as maternal concern, the artful way she reduced a decade of soul-driven work into a shrug of no one really knows why. I could have stood up, I could have spoken, but I didn't. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew that in her world, my words would be treated as insubordination, not truth. So I sat, like I always had, like I was taught to. Let the storm pass. Don't raise your voice, don't make it worse. But what I didn't know, as I sat there quietly, was that someone else at that table, someone who had never spoken up before, was about to do exactly what I never dared to. The clinking of forks and murmured conversation had just begun again when she rose. Quietly, without flourish, but with intention. Amara. All eyes turned toward her, including mine. She stood at the opposite end of the table, still holding her napkin, her other hand resting lightly on Caleb's shoulder. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight," she began. Her voice was calm, but there was a subtle tension in it, like a violin string pulled taut. "But I think I need to." My mother smiled politely, the kind of expression that says know your place, dear. "Oh, sweetheart, there's no pressure." But Amara didn't sit. Instead, she looked directly at my mother and said, "You said something about not knowing why Isabel left her job at Prescott and Wallace." My breath caught. Amara turned toward the rest of the table, her voice rising just enough to be heard, not enough to sound angry. "I do know why." She paused, letting the silence lean forward like a curious guest. "Because she wanted to change lives. And she did." No one moved. "I wouldn't be standing here," Amara continued, "if it weren't for her." My mother blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" Amara smiled gently, but it wasn't sweet. It was steel wrapped in silk. "I grew up in East Point. My mom worked 3 jobs. My dad left when I was 9. We had no money, no college legacy, no path. I got accepted to Emory on scholarship, but the housing costs, the books, I was ready to drop out." She looked at me then, for the first time that night, fully, with knowing. "But someone connected me with a legal aid foundation that didn't just give money. They taught us how to advocate, how to budget, how to pitch for grants. I received a 2-year living stipend that kept me in school. That's the only reason I graduated." Amara turned back to the table. "That foundation was run by the Hartman Initiative, and Isabel was the one who built it." The room stilled. "She didn't just help me, she helped hundreds, thousands now. Most of you have no idea the size of the grants she's facilitated, the reforms she's helped draft, the communities she's lifted." My father set his wineglass down slowly. Amara's gaze returned to my mother. "So yes, she left the firm, because she found something bigger than billable hours, and because people like me needed someone like her to believe we were worth investing in." My mother opened her mouth, but Amara raised a hand. "I'm not finished." The air thickened. "Tonight, you tried to humiliate her, in front of us, in front of strangers. You framed her as a failure because she didn't follow the path you wanted." She looked around the table. "But if success means only doing what looks good in a holiday newsletter, then I'm not sure I belong in this family either." No one spoke. And then, softly, slowly, someone clapped. It was Caleb. Then my father. Then, almost reluctantly, the rest of the table joined in. I sat there frozen, every part of me still catching up to what had just happened. My throat burned with something between gratitude and disbelief. Amara walked over, gently placed a hand on my shoulder, and leaned in. "I knew who you were before I knew who he was," she whispered, "and I'm proud to become your sister." Tears blurred my vision, but I didn't cry. Not yet. Because for the first time in 33 years I was finally seen. Not dissected, not dismissed, seen, and I hadn't had to say a single word. The applause died down eventually. It always does. But something lingered in the silence afterward, something raw, tender, and disorienting, like the air felt different. Lighter, sharper, realer. I didn't speak, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't need to. For the first time in my life, someone had said the thing I had spent years swallowing, and the world hadn't shattered, it had listened. Amara returned to her seat. Caleb looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. My father wouldn't meet my eyes, but his hands were trembling slightly as he refolded his napkin, a small betrayal of something unspoken. My mother? She smiled thinly, a public relations smile, the kind that says, "I will forget this happened." I didn't expect more. Not from her. The rest of the evening unfolded with a strange, suspended quiet. People avoided my gaze and overcompensated with too many compliments about the wine, the lighting, the dessert. I didn't care. I sat there quietly, breathing in a kind of oxygen I had never known before. Oxygen that wasn't filtered through apology or self-censorship. I had always imagined this moment, being defended, being validated, would feel like vindication, a spotlight, a grand, cinematic, "I told you so." But it didn't. It felt quiet, simple. Like something inside me had finally unclenched. Later that night, after the tables had been cleared and the hugs exchanged, I stepped outside alone. The night air was cool, brushing against my shoulders like a gentle reminder that I was still here. Still whole. I leaned against a stone column by the valet and looked up at the sky. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just breathed. Not out of habit, but out of relief. Because this wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about being right. It was about being real. About someone saying my name. Not as a footnote, not as an example of caution, but as someone who mattered. For so long I had thought I was just asking too much. Too much to be understood. Too much to be respected. Too much to be seen as both flawed and worthy. But maybe I wasn't asking too much. Maybe I had just been asking the wrong people. I've come to understand that some kinds of love are conditional on performance, on appearances, on silence. But there's another kind, rarer, quieter, the kind that recognizes your work even when you don't post about it, that sees your heart before it sees your resume. And the people who carry that kind of love, you don't have to beg them to listen. They already are. I don't know what comes next with my family. I don't expect miracles. My mother will rewrite this evening in her head. My father will file it away under things best left unspoken. Caleb, he might need time, but I won't shrink anymore. Not for their comfort, not for their pride. I won't make myself smaller just to fit back into a mold that was never made for me. Because now I've felt it. That moment when truth breaks through expectation. When someone stands for you before you even think to stand for yourself. When you finally exhale. Not because you survived the fire, but because someone else refused to let you burn. And that's what I'll carry with me. Not the applause, not the vindication. Just the air. And the quiet, steady knowledge that I never needed to prove myself. I only needed space to be myself. In the days after the dinner, people began reaching out. An aunt I hadn't spoken to in years sent a message. "I'm so sorry, Isabel, I had no idea. You were so poised." My cousin from Boston liked 3 of my old LinkedIn posts. Even Caleb texted me. "I should have said something sooner. You didn't deserve that." I didn't reply. Not yet. Because it wasn't about them, really. It was about me. Something shifted in that room, not just in how others saw me, but in how I saw myself. Like I had finally stepped out of a costume I didn't know I was wearing. I had always prided myself on endurance. Being the good daughter, the quiet achiever, the one who could sit through anything and still get up the next day to work harder. But maybe that was just another way of surviving. Maybe I had confused resilience with repression. And now, I didn't want to survive anymore. I wanted to live, so I started doing small things that felt like acts of rebellion. But really, they were acts of restoration. I changed my hair. Not dramatically, but enough. A shorter cut. Layers that moved when I walked, like I was no longer trying to stay still for someone else's comfort. I redecorated my apartment, not for style points, but for me. Plants. Deep greens. Books stacked in wild piles. Art from young creators I'd funded through my grant work. I even started singing again. In the kitchen. In the car. Not because I was good at it. God, I wasn't, but because I had stopped waiting to be granted permission to take up space. And more than anything, I began letting people in. Not all at once, but gently. I met Amara for coffee a week after the dinner. She hugged me like we had known each other for years, not months. "You didn't have to say all that," I told her, stirring my cappuccino. "I did," she said simply. "You gave me a future. The least I could do was give you a voice." I wanted to cry, but instead I smiled. The kind of smile that comes from being seen, not admired, not tolerated, but understood. We talked for hours, about family, about justice, about how we'd both learned to measure our worth through other people's lenses, until one day, someone shattered the glass. She invited me to speak at her organization's leadership summit. I almost declined. But then I didn't. Because maybe, finally, I had something worth saying. And not because I had survived humiliation, but because I had outgrown it. At the summit, I stood on a small stage in a borrowed blazer, and talked about failure. Not the dramatic, newsworthy kind, but the invisible kind. The kind that comes when you walk away from what makes others proud to pursue what makes you whole. I told them about nights alone in a drafty office, about scraping together funds for someone else's dream, about writing policy briefs at midnight while my classmates bought second homes. I told them about shrinking, and about stopping. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then applause. But I didn't need the applause. I needed the moment that came after, when a girl no older than 20 came up to me and said, "My mother tells me I'm wasting my potential too, but I think maybe I'm just using it differently." That was it. That was the whole point. We spend so much of our lives trying to be impressive, digestible, likable, but impact doesn't always look like applause. Sometimes it looks like showing up, sometimes it looks like not disappearing. Sometimes it looks like one woman standing up at a dinner table and telling the truth. I walked home that night with no soundtrack, no validation playlist in my earbuds, just the quiet hum of a city that didn't know my name and didn't need to, because I knew it now, and I had claimed it. Isabel Hartman, daughter, advocate, soft speaker, relentless builder, exhaler. I know now that I may never have the kind of family dinners where I'm toasted or bragged about. That's okay. I'll have other tables, tables where no one makes anyone smaller to feel tall, where stories are told in full sentences, not revised summaries, where love doesn't require a resume. Maybe one day I'll sit at a table I built myself, invite the women who stood for me, and the ones I now stand for. And when someone new sits down, small, afraid, unsure if she belongs, I'll pour her a glass of something warm, and I'll say, "You don't have to prove yourself here. You already earned your seat."